Hello, hello, and welcome to the Dear Nikki podcast, where I do my best to answer your questions and struggles and concerns within the field of UX and user research. But today we have a very special guest, and I'm very, very excited to have Ruby Pryor on the podcast today. Welcome, Ruby.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks so much for having me.
Yay. I'm really, really excited. This is a bit of a dream. So yeah, I'm super psyched. Do you mind just giving a quick intro to the audience?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Ruby. I'm the founder of a strategic design and UX research consulting firm called Rex. I am based in Bangkok, Thailand. Previously, I lived in Singapore for 5.5 years, and originally I'm from Australia, Melbourne, Australia.
Cool. Amazing. I love the accent. It's like Australian accents are like one of my favorite.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear.
I'm now I'm bored of the UK accent because I've been here for too long. So I'm like, what's next?
I just love getting a lot of variety in the accents that I hear every day. I find it really enriching. And you also learn, I think, really interesting vocabulary from folks who speak English from all over the world. And I really love that. Like, particularly when I lived in Singapore, they have Singlish, and there's like certain grammar and certain words that are unique to Singapore or maybe unique to the region that were really interesting and kind of fun to learn every day. I mean, now in Thailand, I have to learn a whole new language from scratch, like Thai, which is really, really fun and very challenging.
Are you learning Thai? Like, are you like actively in it?
Chan Rian Pasa Thai.
Wow.
I just said I learned Thai. I mean,
That
I
sounds
mean,
great.
I am. I do lessons twice a week. I think it's a really for me it was a really important part of living in this country was making a real and concerted effort to learn the language. I think it's the most respectful way to be a foreigner living in a country is if you can spend some time to learn the language. And I live in Bangkok, the capital. Everyone I interact with on a daily basis speaks English. I think I wouldn't really have to learn any Thai or very little. I think if I knew hello and thank you, that would absolutely be enough. But
Yes.
I'm finding I'm only a couple of months into living in Thailand, and even with the small bits of Thai that I've learned already, it's just better. Like I think I'm getting a lot more out of the experience, even if the extent of my Thai is usually like, I want to order that one, and I point on the menu rather than like reading out the name of the dish because the script is incredibly difficult. I'm learning that, but very slowly as well. But I just think it's a great way to be if you have the time and space to learn the language. I think it's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I remember you posting on LinkedIn about Singlish as well, and about how different cultures are represented in different ways. And yeah, how most, as you mentioned, most apps are designed for US in mind.
Yeah, I mean, many like global companies, I guess, like started in the US or are headquartered in the US or have the majority of their design and product teams based in the US. And so, of course, you're going to build in things to those applications that reflect your cultural norms or your cultural defaults. And if we don't have a really concerted effort to analyze those things and pick them apart and build a consciousness around them, we'll just build them and release them without really thinking about it. And it might only be when there are a lot of strange like bugs that we're noticing, or like a lot of users dropping off in places or moments we wouldn't expect, or a lot of user error reports, that only then maybe might people start asking the question. And I think it would be really wonderful if from the get-go we could think about localization as going far beyond translation and thinking about how do we actually need to adapt our user experiences to make them really make sense for different locations around the world. And this can be quite large things or they can be quite small things. Like a small one that is nevertheless very frustrating is date formats. So I
Oh,
think the
yes.
US is one of the very few countries in the world that goes month, day, year. And yet there are so many interfaces that I use that have that format. And so often I feel totally bamboozled by
Yeah.
what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Uh, particularly when they only use inline labels. So as soon as you start interacting with the interface, the labels are gone and you're like, hang on, wait a second, was it month, day, or day, month? And it's stressful. And I think it's totally understandable that people would mess that up. And we're talking about something like booking a ticket for a flight. That's potentially thousands of dollars of a purchase. And getting that changed, if you're allowed to, it's a real hassle. And it's an issue for the user experience, but it's also a huge issue for the business because kind of best case if someone has made a mistake is that they have to get on the phone to your customer service representatives, and that costs money and that takes time. But worst case, they defect from your brand, your company altogether because there was an error that you wouldn't or couldn't rectify. And then they say, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to have any part of this organization anymore. And I'm going to tell everyone about it on social media as well. So this stuff really matters to get right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought up the date formatting because as being originally from America, but now being out of America for, know, almost 7 years, I think. I am continuously so confused. I have no idea if my passport expires in June or October anymore, and when I go to fill things out, which is like scary because I remember applying for my visa and I was applying for a UK visa, but using US dates. And I was like, oh, watch me mess this up. And like everything gets denied because I've messed up the date formatting. Right. But as you say, the consequences could be small and it could be easily fixed in a way, but it's a cognitive load on the user to fix it rather than the business starting it out from the get-go and fixing it, well, preventing the error.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Ideally, this is something that you would catch right at the beginning. Like when you set your product strategy and you were saying this is a product that we're going to build and release across the world, you would start there and say, okay, well then how does this sign up form or purchase process or whatever it is, how does that need to look so that it actually makes sense across the world? Another one that you see a lot, particularly in e-commerce, is around currency. So I'm from Australia originally, which uses the dollar. I lived in Singapore for a long time, which uses the dollar. And so every time that I would see a website that just had a dollar and no specificity, I would just be left thinking like, I mean, well, what is it? And this is a big deal because the US dollar has a very different value to the Canadian dollar, to the New Zealand dollar, the Australian, the Singapore dollar. Like these are not at all interchangeable. These can be differences of 30, 40, 50%. So, if you see a price that says $100, like, is that affordable or unaffordable? You can't
Right.
necessarily tell. And it's such an easy fix. Just add the currency in the entire, like every single moment across your checkout journey. And there are a lot of companies do this really well, but it is pretty surprising to me how many countries, how many, I guess, applications and how many, like even web development tools and things like this don't make it super easy for you to add that layer of specificity because it's really important. It really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of this localization and thinking about a product as more of a global product and hey, what works? Because I know we tried to do a credit card reader in Germany on like a
Mm.
form. So like taking a photo or scanning your credit card rather than having to fill in the details. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done because Americans love that. Americans are like super convenient. Germans are like, wow, you're dumb. Why would you ever put like why would you ever do that? Right? Like, and with that came a decrease in conversion rates and click-through
Mhm.
rates, right,
Mhm.
within that particular flow. So our metrics were all messed up because of something we thought we did better, right? And we
Mm.
thought we made more efficient because you look at usability and you look at efficiency, right? And we were like, wow, this is super efficient. It's one of the cornerstones of usability, but it just didn't work within the context of the culture. And so I'm wondering, as user researchers, particularly, how do we fit in to this puzzle within like trying to help with localizing products or thinking about how our lack of localization might impact our impact.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think UX researchers, designers, product managers, all of us have to have a pretty frank conversation with ourselves about about the scope of our product and where we want to make sure we're really designing that experience for. So I think this question has to start really early in the process of building out your customer value proposition, your strategy, like all of these questions around the regions you really want to make sure your product works for need to be asked early and often. And I think UX researchers should absolutely be part of those strategic conversations and should be asking those questions. I think when it comes to our practice more specifically, we also need to make sure that we are speaking to a really good broad range of users when we're doing this kind of work. I mean, it's probably a pipe dream to have a globally representative sample for every bit of user research that we do. However, I think there are some things that we can do even within a constrained scope and budget, and that would be to more deliberately recruit from different cultural groups, from different countries, making sure we're speaking to folks, of different ages, of different backgrounds. So really taking a more robust approach to our sampling to make sure we're doing these things appropriately. I also think there's a case of if you work for a really big international company, something like Google or Amazon, you're going to have teams all over the world. And they're probably able to give you a really good perspective on some of these things just from the get-go. And through things like secondary research and desktop research, through things they already have that they've already noticed, through even processes of doing like an audit of your existing products and just really putting your global hat on and kind of stress testing these experiences and thinking about how they manifest, or even better, like using a VPN and actually looking like how does this interface look across the different regions in which we know people are using our products. Like, I think doing this really true kind of localization is challenging. I don't want to say that it's not. And I know that a lot of companies are now operating in more resource constrained environments than they have been for a really long time. But I think the payoff is there, like you said in your example, that it was affecting the core metrics that you were really looking at. And as user researchers, we should also be keeping our eye on those metrics. It's really important for us to also make sure our practice is oriented towards the same broader goals as the product and business teams and the organizations where we work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you had said there of there is a payoff, right? So it can be really challenging in constrained resources to push forward something that maybe people don't see the value of immediately, but there is that payoff. We got rid of the credit card scanner and our conversion rate went back up, and we actually thought about, hey, how do we make this efficient for Germany rather than efficiency based in America? And that was a game changer, even just thinking about that. And we were already in Germany, but we were operating from like a weird mindset within
Yeah.
that. So I'm curious. I want to dig into the what you said about user researchers orienting themselves within those broader business goals, but I also just quickly want to touch on, do you have any tips for people who are resource constrained, how to maybe position doing more localized or having a more robust sampling of participants for a study?
Yeah, I think there are two ways that you can frame this for maximum impact. So one is around reducing risks or reducing like negative possibilities if you don't do this kind of research. So I think a lot of the work that user researchers do is around reducing risks. Like, we test this prototype so that we're not releasing something to the market that our users are really going to hate and going to have a terrible experience that will have all these other flawed negative consequences. And the fact that we do that early means that none of those negative things happen. And I think that's one reason it can be really hard to quantify the impact of UX research, because it was addressing a risk. We were preventing something, we weren't curing it. And as soon as you occupy that part of the conversation, it does become much harder to kind of credit you because you prevented something from happening. So we can't measure what didn't happen. So I think that's one way to do it, is kind of frame it around we're helping reduce the risk that we release something to the market that really tanks our core metrics.
Yeah.
The other way to do it is in terms of the opportunity. So particularly when you're looking at markets in Asia, like, these are growing markets where firstly, they're massive. Like, the majority of the world's population lives in Asia. If the world had a postcode, it would be 1115. A billion people in Africa, a billion in Europe, a billion in the Americas, and 5 billion in Asia. Like, if your organization says that it's global and is not focusing a majority of its efforts on Asia, it should maybe think again.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, like, numbers of people might not equate to purchasing power and other things like that. But I think the opportunity for brands that haven't really taken the effort to do really good localization and to really think about how their product is going to work in Asia absolutely need to be, because the population is large, and in a lot of countries it's also young. And many brands want to make sure that they are in countries with young populations and gaining a really solid market share, so that as those populations age and as they increase their purchasing power, these brands are already there and they already have that really strong presence. And even getting some market sizing data and putting some facts and figures around those things to really frame up how exciting that opportunity could be for your organization is something that researchers can potentially do. And this is strategy. Like, this is really big question. Like, if you just go to your organization and say, like, I think we're missing an opportunity in the Philippines, like, just be careful that you know what you're saying, right? Because are you actually advocating that your organization, like, opens a new office, like, massively invests in a new market? Like, I think sometimes as people in UX, we can be a little bit idealistic maybe in some of the way that we talk about these things. So I think you've just got to temper some of these conversations a little bit, to make sure that what you're proposing is still tied to the overall strategy of your organization. Because if you're a company, right, that's like based in France and serves French users, but just happens to be used by a lot of people around the world, but your company has decided it actually wants to have a really French strategy and a French user base, that is a legitimate strategic decision that an organization can make. And if you want to challenge that, you've just got to be eyes open to the fact that that's what you're doing, and you may be met with resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. But it is, I love that. It is legitimate for a company to sit down and say, no, we do want to focus in on that because within the German market where we were working, our company said that same thing. So we were pushing other countries, other European countries, but the company was like, we need to stick within our constraints. And it was actually quite helpful to understand that that was a constraint so that we could properly focus and do the research that would impact that particular goal. And of course, challenging things when it's there is it's important for us to be able to do and be proactive and not just kind of react. But I do think that sometimes, as you say, if we want to challenge it, there has to be a very legitimate and data-backed reason for that. And I'm curious because you mapped out the risk and the opportunity. When it comes to impact, especially let's focus on the opportunity. What are some ways that people can gather that data to see, is there an opportunity and how do we map that out to whomever we might be presenting that to?
I think the first thing is to work out who in your organization tends to already be asking these kind of questions that you can collaborate with. And generally, my guess is that it's going to be people that work in strategy and who do not sit in tech. So I find a lot of the time organizations that call themselves tech companies will have a tech side of the organization and a sort of business operations side of the organization. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the time these two sides of the business don't always collaborate with each other, in the way that maybe they could or maybe they should. And so I think often UX researchers will sit under the tech side of an organization, understandably, and will generally work with product stakeholders and design stakeholders, maybe some kind of product analytical stakeholders, engineers, folks like that. And there are all of these other people thinking about very similar things to UX researchers, asking very similar questions around customer experience that we don't always collaborate with. And I think that we absolutely should. So I think that's really important for us, is to kind of map our stakeholders and work out who is asking these questions already and what conversations can we make sure that we are part of and contributing to, so that we can have our perspectives heard and have really important input on some of these strategic questions.
Yeah, I love that. It's going beyond the product people in orgs. And I found that too, where there's like the tech and the business. And sometimes product managers will go in between that.
Mhm.
some, not always, but sometimes depending on the type of product manager. But I think the business space is a wonderful space for user researchers to sit in. And I know that personally, I was extremely intimidated by that. And I was so focused on the user part of user research that I didn't really know how to engage with that business side. So if you are finding yourself intimidated, or if you could give advice to somebody who might feel intimidated, what are some ways to get started in thinking about how business might impact our roles as user researchers?
Good question. I think Yeah, I think like this sense of feeling sort of intimidated by different stakeholders in a business is relatively common, and I think it often flows both ways. I think in the same way like business stakeholders might feel really intimidated by tech stakeholders because they're like, well, I don't really know the ins and outs of the product, or like I don't know how to code, I don't even know what a PRD is, like whatever it is. I think we often can be like really in our own worlds and not always aware of how our discipline is maybe being perceived by others. So I think that's the first thing is, recognize that sense might actually go both ways, and that someone's just waiting for you to sort of extend the first hand over the aisle and start talking to them. So I think finding stakeholders like at your level is also a really good way. Like if you're a junior IC, maybe don't approach like the head of strategy for this conversation start with, like find your peers, and they're probably the most likely to be really open to building these bridges with you, to start kind of that conversation. So I think familiarize yourself with your org chart and really reach out. And I think a lot of the time when folks talk about networking in people's mental model, this often means networking with people outside of the place where you work. But I really think it's so fruitful to network within your own organization. And this is a really underutilized resource by so many people. And just if you find, for example, if you're, a junior UX researcher and you can find someone who's a strategy analyst, they'll probably have a title like that. And you can say like, hey, I'm thinking about some strategic questions regarding X product, and I'd really love to sit down with you and talk about how your team thinks about strategy as it relates to X area. Would you be open to just having a half-hour coffee catch up sometime this week, and keeping it super casual, super light? And I don't think there's many people that are going to say no to that if they're at your level. Like I said, you got to be pretty careful if you're trying to maybe skip too many levels. But I think often folks are more open to this stuff than we think. And I know that when I've tried to do these type of things and sort of network across an organization, I've often been met with a lot of really great reception from folks, because we're all driving towards the same goal. Like I don't think there's anyone in product or in strategy or in operations who doesn't think that their role is also to build a more customer centric product and organization. And sometimes I think we convince ourselves like, oh, that's just us. Like we're the only ones thinking like that. But absolutely not. I think if you asked a product manager, like, what are you really here to do? They would say something like, I'm here to build a product that customers really need and that they love. And that's what UX researchers would say. That's probably what strategy people would say, ops people would say, business people would say. Like we're all really heading towards the same goal. And I think like tap into that kind of shared objective, and that will see you go a long way.
I love that. Yeah, we're all here to do essentially the same job.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I also recognized that product managers are sometimes judged or evaluated on their customer centricity.
Mm.
And they feel, at least a lot of product managers that I've spoken to feel quite overwhelmed without knowing how to exactly do research or how exactly to be customer centric in the best way. So by having those conversations, you're also probably helping that person with understanding their role better and how they can be better at certain parts of their role, and likely vice versa, because I do know I learned a lot from product managers when it came to business, like metrics that I had no idea really existed or were important. I learned quite a lot from product managers. So I think opening up that two-way street via a casual coffee is a great way. And it's low stakes too.
Yeah.
If you're just like going, you're not doing a formal presentation trying to convince somebody to listen to you about something that you're scared they won't. You're in a low stakes environment where you can just have that curiosity about
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
other person.
Exactly. Exactly, exactly. And like you say, if at the end of that conversation they walk away thinking, wow, collaborating with this user researcher is going to make my job easier, that's really what you want,
Yeah.
because I think there is a small risk that people are like, you're going to add to my workload somehow. Like, no one really wants that. But if you come into this thinking, like, this is about collaborating so that we're going to get to a better outcome and I'm going to make it easier for you, like in your example, I'm going to really help you with that customer centricity that I know is really important to you. That's gold. Like, I don't think there's many stakeholders who won't like that. It's the same skills, right? It's just doing like user research on your stakeholders.
Yeah. I know it's so funny how sometimes we're so good at wearing that hat in certain situations. And then as soon as something else comes along that's like a little bit different, we're like, whoa, what's research? I'm going to assume that you hate me and that you hate user research. It's funny how we can do that. I mean, it makes sense. But yeah, I'd love to just talk quickly about risk and
Mm,
mitigating risk because I also hugely agree that as researchers, that's what we're doing, reducing risk, mitigating risk. And I'm wondering for those of us who might not know how to demonstrate how impactful that might be, do you have any tips for people who are trying to have those conversations of user research is great because it reduces risks and people are like that sounds nice but it's so intangible.
yeah, 100%. I think what is really important is that you document what decisions were these stakeholders going to make. Then you do the research and then you document what decisions were actually made. And I think often we don't have solid documentation of that before and after. And so it's hard to show what changed because before people are like, oh, we're thinking through a few options. But a lot of the time, folks don't do research and they make a decision anyway. So there was a course of action that they were going to take. So I think it is important to kind of really isolate what would you have done and now look at this difference. And this is really the impact that I have made. Instead of building feature A, we're now building feature B. And that is, I think, the best way that you can kind of show it. So that's qualitative, saying that I helped an organization make a different decision around the prioritization of its resources.
Yeah.
That's good. You can even take that a step further. So you can actually quantify that with a dollar value if you chose, because building a feature is incredibly expensive. You have design effort, you have engineering effort, you have PM effort, you probably have some analytics in there. You've got back end and you've got front end, and you've got all the reviews all the way through, and you've got QA and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you add up how many days of effort it would have taken each and every one of those stakeholders to build that product, and if you then assign a dollar value to that time, based on more or less what the salary of that employee is, and you multiply all of that together, you're going to come up with a number. And if you have helped your organization realize, hey, we really shouldn't build this feature because it's going to tank, customers hate it, it's breaking the process, et cetera, and that feature would have taken us 6 weeks to build. If you do all of the maths on that, that's probably a saving of like $100,000 that you helped your organization realize because of the research that you did. And now that's quantified. So you can say, like, I helped this organization, or based on my research, this organization made a different decision around the feature set that we would build. And in doing so, I saved the organization in the order of approximately $100,000 through internal resources.
Yeah, I love that. I think we really just the before and after is beautiful. Here's the decision we were heading towards, course correct, hopefully, or maybe not,
Maybe
right?
not, also fine.
Yeah, yeah. Also fine is like, I hate the word validated, but we evaluated this and it's aligning with people's needs and pain points. So that's also very
Yep.
valid. But yeah, I love that. Here's how it shifted. Here's how we course corrected, and here's the dollar amount that we were able to save because of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I think it would concern me if every time we did a piece of research, we ended up having to course correct. Like that would say to me that something has gone wrong with that foundational understanding that our organization has of its users. And I know a lot of the time researchers feel under this intense pressure for new findings. We've got to find new findings all the time, or we've got to have these incredibly sort of big shiny findings from our research that if we'd launched this feature, we would have lost 50% of our users or whatever it is. Like we all kind of want those like huge headlines. But if you are just finding things that are building on this solid understanding of customers that you have already, and you are helping the organization build a capability in that understanding, that is doing your job. And that is also incredibly valuable. If you can survey like the PMs and the decision makers in your organization and realize that a lot of the time our research is backing up the decisions that they were making already because of the work the UX research team has been historically doing, and that's what's really important. Take credit where you earned
Yeah.
it, then that's also a huge win that you can paint for your team as well. Like at the end of the day, just take credit for your wins. I think sometimes we're a little bit too humble, and humility doesn't always get you a promotion.
No, very rarely does it, I feel like. But I love that because a lot of people talk about how hard it is to quantify or demonstrate the impact of that foundational research. And I think that that's really powerful to kind of say, hey, this foundational research or this foundation that we're building is leading to us to make better decisions generally.
Yeah.
And that's efficiency as well, where things are going to be able to go faster if we have this foundational understanding and we're not guessing and assuming and hoping for the best.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. So I think about the impact that UX researchers can make at four levels. So I think the foundational level is that insights layer. Are we building and enhancing our organization's knowledge of our users? One level up from that is about optimization. So are we helping our organization make the products and features we have already better? One layer up from that is around prioritization. So, are we helping this organization make better prioritization decisions about what features they build sooner rather than later, or they build at all, like A over B? And then finally, I think there's strategy. So, strategy, I think, is impacting those really large questions that we started the episode talking about. So, things around what market do we play in? Who's our target customer? And what problems are we here to solve? And I really believe that UX researchers can have impact at every single layer of this pyramid of impact, and that we can talk about really compellingly that kind of impact we're making across an organization.
I love that. That's such a nice way to frame it for people to be able to like take that and say, okay, where am I making this impact in these different levels? And be able to also probably move up as
Mm.
well. Um, but yeah, Ruby, thank you so much. This was such an amazing chat, and it was just full of amazing things. So I really, really appreciate it. And I'm curious, where can people learn more about you and what you do and how you help researchers with impact?
Absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn. If you look up Ruby Pryor, I'm sure you'll come across me. My company website is rexhq.io, rexhq.io. And you can find out there more about our consulting services as well as some of the courses that I run. So right now I have open for enrollment a new Maven cohort all about writing for impact. So teaching UX researchers how to really write like super pointy insights, how to build frameworks out of our qualitative data to increase their impact, and how to write really compelling reports and impact statements. Like, I believe writing is an absolutely crucial skill for anyone that works with insights, researchers, designers, PMs. And so my cohort is all about doing that.
Amazing. Yeah, I will put all of those links in the show notes so people can find you. And when does that cohort start? And when does signups close?
Yeah, so signups will close at the end of October, sort of start of November. So that cohort itself is going to start on the 12th of November.
Nice. Oh, that's so exciting. I love that.
Yeah,
Amazing.
I'm really excited.
Yeah. I know. I agree that writing is, I mean, as a fiction writer, I think writing is amazing and perfect and unbelievable. But as a user researcher, it's just as important to me. So yeah, I think that that sounds like it will be a really awesome and beneficial course for anybody. So thank you so much for sharing everything that you did today. This was super cool, super fun conversation, and I can't wait to post it. And yeah, I hope that we will cross paths again very soon. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nikki. This was great.